Меня зовут Сэм Грин, я рад вас приветствовать в очередной раз здесь, в Московском центре Карнеги, и вам представить моего нового коллегу из Вашингтона, который приехал, это Мэтт Раджанский, новый заместитель директора российской программы фонда Карнеги за международный мир. Мэтт во многом встанет в истоке дальнейшего развития, расширения этой программы в Москве, то есть в Вашингтоне и на глобальном уровне, работает вместе с бывшим послом США в России Джимом Коллинзом, многим из вас известным. Да, буквально неделю назад Мэтт работал исполнительным директором партнерства за безопасную Америку, внепартийная или непартийная организация, которая была создана одним конгрессменом из Демократической партии, одним сенатором из Республиканской партии, для того, чтобы найти подходы к решению задач безопасности США, которые могли бы объединить представителей обеих ведущих политических партий. Мы очень рады, что мы смогли привлечь к нам человека такого уровня и с такими отношениями и на капиталистском холме, о которых, собственно, Мэтт будем нам сегодня и рассказывать. На прошлой неделе в этом же зале многие из вас слышали доклад Сэма Черопа, который говорил о перспективах ратификации нового договора об СНВ. До этого здесь выступал Строуп Талбот, который говорил много о том же и о российско-американских отношениях в целом. Мэтт сегодня будет говорить нам более подробно о том, как делается внешняя политика в Конгрессе. И мы тогда в обсуждении, в дискуссии сможем подойти вплотную к тому, как это отразится на российско-американских отношениях. С этим я передаю слово Мэтту. Еще раз повторюсь, что доклад пройдет на английском языке, хоть Мэтт прекрасно понимает и говорит на русском. Во многом это для удобства наших зрителей, которые это увидят в записи на вашингтонском сайте. Но вопросы можете задавать на любом удобном вам языке. Спасибо, и слово Мэтту, пожалуйста.
Thank you very much, Sam. And by the way, that was a polite way for Sam to say, I'm speaking in English on behalf of our viewers elsewhere in the world. In actual fact, I suspect if I were to give this presentation in Russian, a lot of the detail might be lost. So I'll apologize for that. I'll also apologize for the fact that because I so recently have joined Carnegie, the visual aspects of this presentation still bear the colors of my previous employer, which are both red and blue, and for those who are familiar with the American political environment, that means both Democrat and Republican, because it was in fact a bipartisan organization. And then my third apology, by way of preface, is that in fact I am not going to talk specifically about the U.S.-Russia relationship until we get into the discussion, the question and answer. This is more broadly about foreign policy in the United States Congress. And specifically with respect to the tradition of bipartisan Democrat and Republican foreign policy that in the last decade to 2 decades in the United States has disappeared. Why has that happened? How is it happening? And how can we turn that trend around? So this is really the essence of the data that you will find in the report that I put together and was only published really in the last week. In fact, this is still almost a near final draft that you have. But the data collection is complete. In fact, the printed copy of the report reflects even slightly more updated data than you see in this graphic here, because the very last 2009 data that's available reflects a slight increase in bipartisanship. Just for technical understanding, bipartisanship is measured by a simple equation. It's the number of Democrat the number of votes in which a majority of Democrats and a majority of Republicans voted the same way on an issue of national security or foreign policy divided by the number of total votes. Very simple. So it's a percentage. And those percentages are reflected here in this chart. And what you see is that overall, over the past 60 years, it is a distinctly downward trend, with many ups and many downs. And we're going to talk about some of those, and we're going to talk about why this is happening. But first, just a word about the Partnership for a Secure America. As Sam said, this is an organization that was founded by Lee Hamilton, who's a very famous and well-respected Democratic American congressman. He chaired the House International Relations Committee. He co-chaired the 9/11 Commission, the Commission on Iraq, and many other bipartisan commissions. And Warren Rudman, who is a Republican senator from New Hampshire, he was a top advisor to John McCain, a close friend of many Republican presidents, and is very well known. The two of these gentlemen came together with a number of their colleagues, all retired from government. It's a very important point. None of them are currently running for political office or otherwise engaged in the political process for their own personal benefit, and therefore they were able to come together. And just for the benefit of those who can't see, these are people like Warren Christopher, Bill Perry, Sam Nunn, Howard Baker, Tony Lake, Bud McFarlane. These are names that should be familiar to anyone who's been involved in the U.S.-Russia relationship any time in the last 2 decades. So the challenge of doing foreign policy on a bipartisan basis in the United States Congress is certainly a difficult one. As the picture here illustrates, there are many who think it's an impossible challenge. I'm of a different view because I believe that the history and the essence of bipartisan policymaking necessitates that. But let's define our terms before we proceed any farther. What is bipartisanship? First, it is process-oriented. It is about interaction between the political parties. And I describe that as a deliberative interaction, whereby ideas, and that's point 2, are aired, that ideas have their own merit. Many ideas are considered regardless of the source. Some people call this nonpartisan. Sam, in fact, I think used that term in his introduction. I would agree with that to an extent, with the qualification that bipartisanship recognizes that the situation in the United States is a two-party political atmosphere, and that there will always be two political parties with competing views in the United States, and that to set about to suggest that there is one right answer that all parties should subscribe to at any given time is perhaps not realistic. Hence, bipartisanship instead of non-partisanship. Third, bipartisanship is necessary for the policymaking system to function. We'll talk more about why it is actually not only necessary in a moral sense, but in an institutional sense. It's fundamentally built into the system that bipartisan decisions are more effective decisions. And lastly, it is naturally linked with the greatest challenges in national security that the United States has ever faced. And the Cold War is certainly the best example of that. That's something that will be familiar to those of you who recall that Democratic and Republican presidents and Republican and Democratic Congresses were more or less fully engaged in the challenge of the Cold War on the same basis. And just to suggest a few of the major overarching national challenges the United States faces today, so that we don't think that because the Cold War has ended, the need for bipartisanship in foreign policy has disappeared. Another important warning or caveat is from one of my colleagues in Washington who said that even the best bipartisan deliberation does not guarantee sound policy, and the absence of bipartisanship doesn't prevent it. So, bipartisanship is, generally speaking, necessary but not sufficient for good foreign policy. Another caveat is that political parties are important. I'm not arguing against the role of politics in national security. I'm arguing against the role of partisanship, and these are two different concepts. The reason political parties are important is simple. Political parties help to take many people, aggregate their views, aggregate their knowledge into something that's digestible and understandable. Through debates, which come about generally in the context of political parties and party competition. They help to clarify issues. Where do we agree and where do we disagree? That's very important. Through party platforms, in other words, the sets of positions that political parties represent on a broad range of issues, they help average people who don't think about every issue, if they even think about one issue, to feel more engaged in the political process. They can say, I'm generally speaking a Democrat, I'm generally speaking a Republican, and so I know generally that I support the following positions. Lastly, they're important. You have there a picture, I think, of the coronation. Actually, I'm not sure who that is, but you have generally the opportunity through political party competition for new blood to enter the system, as opposed to in a monarchy or an autocratic system where generally there's one dominant political entity and they bring up new people, if at all, through a process that sort of limits their thinking. So it's helpful to have two parties in that respect as well. But, of course, the process has been taken to an extreme, as illustrated by my Three Stooges picture. So why is bipartisanship necessary? Obviously, if we're pushing in opposite directions, we don't go anywhere. First reason that bipartisanship is necessary for the American political system is that system, unlike our judicial system, does not depend on what's called zealous advocacy. The idea that if a person on one side pushes as hard as they possibly can for their position, and a person on the other side pushes in the opposite direction, a neutral judge or a neutral jury will decide what the truth is. We don't have that in the legislative branch. In the legislative branch, you only have the two parties, which means at the end of the day, no matter how hard each of the two parties push, they have to come together in order for anything to happen. And so unlike a courtroom where the two sides can walk out the door having completely destroyed any relationship they had with each other, we cannot afford to do that in the legislative branch of government. Another reason is because Democrats and Republicans bring different skills to the table. Democrats have experience that Republicans don't have, and vice versa. And when it comes to foreign policy, where most members of Congress don't know very much at all, it's critical that we pool and collect all the knowledge that we have. So thinking what I call with both halves of our brain. Second, the problem of swing votes. When political parties reliably only vote in one direction all the time, that means that the one or two members in the middle who are willing to swing back and forth basically decide all of the questions. And we've seen an illustration of that very recently in the United States Senate, where one or two senators were able to sit down with the party leaders on both sides and basically have an auction for who could buy them. And lastly, because in order to implement foreign policy programs, you need money. And in order to have sustainable funding for the long term, when control of Congress will change between Democrats and Republicans, you need to have both sides signed up for the same program. Otherwise, as soon as control of Congress changes, the money will disappear. This is just a sort of an illustration of the importance of one more point, which is continuity. In a relationship like the U.S.-Russia relationship or the U.S.-Soviet relationship, it was important that American administrations and American Congresses be perceived as fully engaged throughout the duration of that relationship of 50 years or more. Otherwise, both sides might lose confidence in the purpose of the relationship, or one side might try to take advantage of changes in political power on the other side. That was very important during the Cold War. And then lastly, perhaps most importantly, there are some things that you just can't achieve without bipartisan support. Those are usually things that are in the long-term interests of the country, but in the short term don't appear so. So for example, free trade. Signing a free trade agreement with a foreign country is one of the most difficult things that an American president can do, because it seems in the short term that it will cost jobs, particularly in some states in the United States. And without bipartisan agreement to provide the political sort of safety zone or cover, that would never be possible. There's kind of a new, what I would call conventional wisdom, or a sort of popular criticism of bipartisanship in Washington, which is that it's a waste of time because it doesn't work. Well, I would agree that it hasn't been working lately, but I wouldn't agree it's a waste of time, and I would just point out that a lot of the biggest critics of bipartisanship, if you look at why they're criticizing, it's because they are personally interested in more partisan politics. And I'll talk more about who and why that is. So just a word about the history of the role of bipartisanship in U.S. foreign policy. It's something that's been supported by many deeply respected foreign policy thinkers from the 1950s to the present day. Senator Arthur Vandenberg, who together with Harry Truman introduced NATO, the Marshall Plan, the United Nations, many of the basic ideas they supported on a bipartisan basis. Henry Kissinger, John F. Kennedy, Chuck Hagel, Lee Hamilton, Dick Lugar have all come out strongly in support of bipartisanship. So there's a strong tradition among the most respected foreign policy thinkers in America. In fact, very recently, President Obama sat down with a group of 4 leading national security experts, 2 Democrats, 2 Republicans, Sam Nunn, George Shultz are pictured here, Henry Kissinger, and Bill Perry as well. And after coming out of that meeting, President Obama specifically talked about the long tradition of bipartisan foreign policy that has been a hallmark of America at moments of greatest need. However, it wasn't always the case. One famous example is when President Wilson brought an American delegation to the Versailles Peace Conference, at which the American idea for a League of Nations was discussed. He failed to bring any Republicans with him. Now, that would have been one thing had the Republicans been in the minority at the time, as they are today in the Congress. But actually, at that time, the Republicans had just won a large victory and became the majority in the Congress, which is an illustration of the importance of continuity over time. So by failing to take any Republicans, he made enemies with an important senator, among others, Senator La Follette of Wisconsin, who described the president as being cocksure and stubborn, as well as inexperienced and ignorant of more than the merest smattering of problems. And of course, he accused the president of being intensely partisan, making him almost impossible to work with. So it's rhetoric that we're used to hearing today in Washington. It's interesting that this was almost 100 years ago, and the result of this, as we all know, was that the United States did not join the League of Nations, and we had World War II. Other famous failures, Teddy Roosevelt, in trying to reform the tariff system, despite being a relatively liberal or progressive Republican, failed to engage with progressive Democrats, and so he had bipartisan opposition to his tariff reform. President Carter, in his pursuance of arms control, had absolutely almost no Republican support, meaning that most of the deliverables occurred subsequently in the Reagan administration. I love the example of Vietnam. This is the same exact war being pursued by a Democratic president and then a Republican president. And yet when it was being pursued by a Democratic president, through ineptitude on his part primarily, he was being attacked by Republicans, and vice versa. President Nixon was almost exclusively attacked by Democrats. President Clinton, I think a famous case would be the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. Not a single Republican voted for that treaty. Again, it was President Clinton's failure to reach out effectively to Republicans. President Bush, many examples. Certainly the Iraq War provides the best and a relatively recent one of those. A famous success, probably the most famous, was during World War II when President Roosevelt, who had just defeated Wendell Willkie, his Republican opponent, actually reached out to Willkie and made him his emissary to the rest of the world to try to drum up support for the Great War for democracy. But other famous successes include, as I mentioned, cooperation between President Truman and Republican senators. President Carter worked with both the Democratic and Republican leaders. The Nunn-Lugar program is a great example. The achievements of that program are well known to people here in Russia as well as at home. And then President Reagan, this is amazing, worked with Tip O'Neill, the Speaker of the U.S. House, who was probably one of the most liberal Democrats, and Reagan was among the most conservative Republican presidents. But those two had a famously productive relationship. The downside of bipartisanship is interesting, which is that for a period of about 30 years, while there was consensus on foreign policy, the same consensus dominated in domestic policy in a very negative way, which was that there was essentially no movement on civil rights or other domestic civil liberties, and so the Southern segregationists were able to sort of make a deal where they supported Republicans on foreign policy, but instead maintained segregation at home. So there are downsides. Recently, if you look at voting in the American Congress, you find that the votes are kind of all over the place. You know, for Afghanistan, we had a 98-0 vote in favor, so bipartisan. The Iraq invasion vote was not quite as bipartisan, but still the Patriot Act, which was the package of reforms that were passed after September 11th, also bipartisan. And then yet, almost everything that President Obama has done has been received on a totally partisan basis. So his first budget was a purely partisan vote with no Republican support. The health care reform bill, no Republican support. All right, so why has all of this happened? Let's just talk about some of the fundamental causes. Many Americans would argue that, well, our country as a whole is just more partisan. If you look at the numbers, that appears to be true, at least on some issues. More Republicans support capital punishment, more Democrats oppose it. More Republicans oppose gay marriage, more Democrats oppose it, or support it, excuse me. Global warming, stem cell research, all of these sort of social issues in America, we're very divided. Similarly, it's interesting to note that the gap, and that's the number on the far right, the gap between Democrats' approval of a president and Republican approval of a president has grown consistently from Nixon, which the gap was less than 30 points. As controversial a figure as Nixon was, there was only a difference of 30 points in Democrat-Republican approval. Today, that has more than doubled, with Republicans hating Obama and Democrats loving him. So it would seem like we're a much more polarized country. If you ask the average person whether we are more polarized, they generally agree. The majority of people say that Democrats and Republicans have been bickering more than ever this year, and the country is more politically divided than ever. That has been consistently true for the last 5 years. Everybody thinks America is more divided. But interestingly, if you look at foreign policy, that's not the case. If you look at a list of top American national security and foreign policy priorities, almost the same numbers of Democrats and Republicans agree about those priorities. America's standing in the world, preventing WMD, weapon of mass destruction, spreading, protecting against terrorism, reducing energy dependence, the challenge from China, from North Korea, from Pakistan, from Iran. Across the board, Democrats and Republicans agree at least that these are top priorities, and we can talk about the details in terms of their disagreements about how we approach them. So why is this happening? I think the first reason is you have to look at who members of Congress are and how they get there. Members of the House are elected from political districts, which are subsets of individual states. You can see on the board maps of some of these political districts. There's absolutely no logic to these maps in a geographic sense. The logic is purely political. They are designed, the term is gerrymandered, they're designed to support a Democratic candidate or a Republican candidate. Well, the result of that when that happens is that the general election doesn't matter, because if there are 80% Democrats in a given political district, then the Democrat will always win. The Republican will never have a chance. What matters is the primary election, the election to pick who the Democratic candidate will be. And when that's the case, usually the candidate is pushed farther to the left or farther to the right, because the people who vote in the primary election are only people who are party members, and they are more to the left or more to the right. So gerrymandering of political districts is the first problem. The second problem is the influence of money in politics. In 1976, it cost roughly $600,000 to win a seat in the United States Senate. In 2000, it cost $7.2 million. And by the way, those are in today's dollars. That's accounting for inflation. In 1974, it cost over or under $100,000 to beat an incumbent in the United States House. In 2002, it cost over $1.5 million, again, adjusted for inflation. So the fact is, what members of Congress are forced to do, first of all, is constantly be chasing money, which means they're not working on their jobs, they're not spending time with one another, they're definitely not wasting time with someone who might be their opponent. They're spending time with people who are going to support their cause, who are people on their team. Also, just a quick point about our campaign finance reform laws, which you may have heard about. Unfortunately, the result of campaign finance reform has in some ways been the exact opposite of what it was supposed to be. By limiting the dollar amount that each individual can give to $2,500, which is a pretty small amount of money, what that means is that in order to receive enough money for a campaign, a candidate needs to bundle together lots and lots of small donations into a big donation. Well, who has the ability to do that? political parties. So this has made the role of political parties and political organizations much, much more important for candidates who can no longer go to wealthy individuals or institutions to solicit contributions. All right, there are also some very important causes that have to do with the way life in Congress functions. And for any of you who have ever had any interaction with Congress, this should be obvious. Congress doesn't work a full week. We work Monday through Friday, most of the world. Sometimes an additional weekend day. Congress works Tuesday through Thursday. And that is so that members of Congress can fly home to where they're from on Friday and stay through Monday, because they have to raise money, and they have to be on television, and they have to go to parades. That's a new factor. 50 years ago, 100 years ago, members of Congress lived in Washington until the summertime, and in the summertime they went home. But when they lived in Washington, they lived together, they knew each other, their children played together, they went to the same schools. So Democrats and Republicans were forced to socialize. There's a hugely increased workload on Capitol Hill. Just to give an example, the health care bill was over 10,000 pages long. No one in Congress read that bill, but the simple fact of having to put that together requires tons of staff, tons of meetings. It's a workload that no one can handle, and it doesn't leave time for anything else. Members of Congress have more assignments to committees today than they used to, which means they're expected to be in more places. They have more meeting requests from lobbyists and from voters back home, and that's simply because those people can fly to Washington much more easily, and there are more lobbyists. They spend more time with the media because we have more television channels, and more of them are 24-hour television channels. And lastly, this is kind of an interesting wrinkle. It used to be, because of technology again, that members of Congress had to go to the floor of the House, in other words, to the actual chamber, and wait around for their name to be called in order to vote. That's no longer the case. Now they vote with an electronic card, which means they walk to the floor with 5 or 6 of their retinue around them, conducting another meeting or an interview while they're doing it. They stick their card in, they press a button, and they leave. So they actually don't interact with other members, with their colleagues, only with their staff and with the media and folks who come to see them. This is just an example of a committee hearing room. I want to emphasize this point. Notice lots of experts lined up like we are here to answer questions so that members of Congress can learn, and nobody's watching. This is a typical committee hearing in Congress today. Subcommittees, it's especially bad. Usually you'll have one person sitting there. It's usually the chairman of the committee, but he or she will often leave after 5 or 10 minutes, be replaced by maybe one other member. So the reality is members of Congress are not really spending any time in the committees that they're assigned to anyway. So you ask, well, why should we have these in the first place? This speaks to the larger paradox, which is that in American business, and I think in business internationally, a lot of deals are done on the golf course. In other words, it's through social interaction, having a drink together, getting to know each other, having a meal. That's where business is done. And we elect members of Congress to go to Washington to do business, but because of the demands that we put on their schedules, because of the demands put on them by the media, by lobbyists and special interests, they don't actually have time to do these things. They don't get to know each other, and they're not getting business done. Just a couple of quotes. I like this one. Senator Rudman, who's my former boss, says that all my friends are back home in New Hampshire. I don't have any friends in Washington. So, as I said, no friends. All right. A few more important structural causes. Discipline by party leaders. This is very important. 2 ways in which party leaders can exercise discipline. One is the calendar. If there's somebody important that you want appointed to be a judge or to be an ambassador because he's a friend of yours, because he's from your home state, because he's someone who donated to your campaign, you better be good friends with the party leadership because they're the ones who schedule that vote. And if they don't like you, they're not going to schedule the vote. The second way, of course, is that party leaders are usually some of the safest elected officials, which means they don't have to spend a lot on their own re-election campaigns because why would the folks back home vote them out of power when they're some of the most influential people in Washington? There is an exception to that right now, which is Harry Reid, the Democratic leader from Nevada, is in some trouble. But that means that party leaders have a lot of money at their disposal from their own campaign war chests and from the party, and they can hand out that money. And there's no limit on the money that the party can spend on behalf of an individual candidate. So that gives them a lot of ability to influence candidates. Second is the end of seniority. The so-called Watergate Babies. These were the members of Congress elected in 1975 after the Watergate scandal. They ended seniority for committee chairmen, which means the committee chairmen are generally now younger and weaker than they used to be, and they cannot stand up to the party leaders. The Republican Revolution in 1994 completed that trend. Newt Gingrich was famous in the 1980s for speaking out against Tip O'Neill, who was, as I mentioned, an ally of President Reagan and the Speaker of the House, and he was primed when he came into leadership to strengthen the role of the central party leaders in Congress. I provide a picture here of a coach in a basketball team. This happens to be the Duke basketball team because they're very famous for being greater than the sum of their parts. The idea is you take individual players, and instead of playing as individuals, they play as a team, and it makes them stronger. That might make sense for government, but it certainly doesn't make sense for politics. In politics, you want individual voices, people who are willing to speak out for unpopular positions because they're elected by the people to do so. That doesn't happen in American politics. Another important factor is the increasing role of outsiders. They often describe Congress and American politics as the ultimate insiders club. But the reality is outsiders have tremendous influence. At the bottom of the screen, you see a picture of grassroots. Grassroots is a sort of key term to describe the role of voters in politics, except it's not voters. What it is the organizations who can organize and represent voters. And here there are some pictures of some famous liberal activist groups. But it's not just liberal activist groups. In the 1960s, you had the creation of many liberal groups which brought elite young Americans from the Ivy League and with great educations to Washington to lobby on behalf of these causes. But of course, there were conservative responses to these as well. So now what we have is we have a professional class of political advocates who are not in government. That means they don't bear a responsibility to get anything done. They are responsible to the political constituency that employs them, that pays them to work. And unfortunately, we've even had this happen in the think tank world. With no disrespect meant to my colleague Sam, who was here last week, the Center for American Progress is a Democratic Party think tank. The Heritage Foundation is a Republican Party think tank. I like to think that the Carnegie Endowment is in the middle, that we're a nonpartisan think tank, that we're bipartisan. I think we are. But the fact that this is even an issue in Washington today is an indication of how far we've come down this very dangerous road. And I would just say that the notion that partisan conflict has been institutionalized in the big famous think tanks and other organizations in Washington is good for those who want to have job security, because they know they can go through the revolving door from a Democratic Party institution to a Democratic congressman to a Democratic administration and back out to a Democratic institution. But it's not good for the system overall, and I'm not picking on Democrats, it's true of Republicans as well. We also have sort of a media phenomenon going on. On the right, you see an advertisement that ran in the New York Times. This is a play on words, General Petraeus or General Betray Us, which was an attack on the commanding general in Iraq by a liberal group called MoveOn.org, whose mission is to bring new donors into the Democratic Party and to hurt Republicans. And below that, you have a picture of Rush Limbaugh, whose mission in life is to find and discredit Democrats. And he did that very well with President Clinton. That's why he's holding a cigar in this picture. He's an interesting character. But the point is, essentially, we have declining contact between officials in the executive administration and Congress. President Obama has turned that around a little bit. And at the same time, we have increasing contact between the media and the political class. And these two things are pulling in different directions. There are two networks in the United States that are famous now for being partisan. Fox News is sort of a Republican outlet. MSNBC is generally considered a more Democratic outlet. And these two gentlemen on the right, even though they're sort of portrayed as news anchors, like Walter Cronkite, sort of a trusted nonpartisan source, these two guys have actually made their careers by fighting with each other on the TV airwaves. And as I mentioned, the 24-hour news has sort of increased the pressure for politicians to spend more time with these people. The more time they spend with them, the more they have to pick sides, the more they have to cater to this problem. So finally, a slightly more sociological or psychological explanation for what's going on is that it's basically just easier for the human brain to deal with partisanship. So-called System 1 reactions or Stone Age brain reactions are very intuitive, fast. Is this a threat to me? What do I need to do to respond and keep myself safe? System 2 reactions take much more time to think about the evidence, the pluses and the minuses, and to make a judgment. Politicians don't have time. They rely on System 1 reactions. Second, the so-called rule of typical things. A single example proves the rule. We have a lot of very polarizing examples in American politics today. Dick Cheney, Nancy Pelosi are considered sort of extremes, but they are not, in fact, the majority. But they are perceived to be the majority because their images and their words are constantly repeated, and so it becomes the rule for how Americans think about politics. Two more factors: confirmation bias. You come in knowing what you believe, and so the evidence you hear confirms what you already believe. And lastly, the herd mentality. If you watch political theater, which is political conventions, so when you have the presidential campaigns, you have big gatherings of people. It's a great example of herd mentality. No one would want to stand up and oppose the herd. Everyone wants to go with the flow. I mentioned some reasons how the party leaders discipline anyone who doesn't do that. That wasn't always true. 100 years ago, American political conventions were debate societies. People would come to the convention to debate who the nominee should be. Today, that's not true. Everybody comes. Everybody knows who the nominee should be. So what do we do to fix this problem? Just quickly, President Obama has set a very positive tone with leadership. He's kept more than a handful of Republicans or appointed new ones. Bob Gates, Republican appointee. Jim Jones advised John McCain. Ray LaHood is his Secretary of Transportation. He was a Republican congressman. John McCune is the Secretary of the Army, also a Republican congressman. The picture on the bottom left is a picture of President Obama hosting a Super Bowl party for Democrat and Republican members of Congress and actually going around and serving appetizers. You know what? It's a great strategy if you want to make friends. So what else can the president do? Bipartisan cabinet appointments, very important. Bipartisan working groups bring together experts from both sides, people who formerly served in government, people like the board of the organization where I used to serve, and ask them what they think about issues, and do it repeatedly. That's the key. Build relationships. Also, consult regularly with leaders of both parties of Congress. So don't just wait until there's a crisis and then call everyone together and see if they agree. Bring them together on a regular basis, biweekly, monthly, etc., and also meet with former party leaders. Because like I said about the board of PSA, my organization, these folks have less to lose. And if they have less invested in the current political climate, then they're going to be more willing to make compromises. So it's a two-way street, though, which means Congress has to do some things as well. It would make a lot of sense to get outside the committee structure and just have so-called caucus meetings. Caucuses are informal groups of people who are interested in a subject. And in fact, there was recently a Russia caucus created by a Republican member of Congress and a Democratic member of Congress. I'd be happy to comment on that. But also to deal specifically with the problem of committees, reduce the number of committees that members sit on so that they can actually sit in committees, get to know their fellow committee members, making Senate appointments faster so that individual senators cannot put a hold on an appointment and certainly cannot do so secretly. Congressional delegations, CODELs, these are trips abroad for members of Congress. They're very important because when members of Congress go abroad, not only do they learn about the world around them, which supposedly they're making decisions about, but they also spend time with each other in an environment where there's less press following them around, there are less pressures, they don't have voters coming to see them, knocking on their door. So it's a good way for them to bond and get to know each other. I know that Senator Margolov recently led a delegation to Washington. I'm sure that the result there for him was very good in terms of the time that he spent not only with Americans but with his own colleagues. The so-called filibuster majority is 60 votes out of 100 in the Senate. I think if you look at the numbers in the Senate today, 60 votes is too close to the dividing line between the Democratic number and the Republican number. The Democrats have roughly 58, 59 votes. The Republicans have 40. So that means that all you need to do is win 1 or 2 votes to win on any issue. So if you move that up to 2/3, 67, then you would have to win 8 or 10 people. And that means you're more likely to have relationships with more people. So I think that would be an effective reform. And lastly, committee chairs need to request that every question end with a question mark. No speeches, and that members have to sit and listen. Structural reforms, like I mentioned, the gerrymandering of political districts needs to end. The state of Iowa is a good example. They have 5 congressional seats. 3 are held by Democrats. 2 are held by Republicans. They are always competitive, and the reason for that is they follow these square grids. They follow the county lines instead of drawing political districts according to population politics and letting the state legislators do it. I'm going to skip through some of these specific reforms. Just a note about an interesting program that my old organization is running. We bring about 30 congressional staff. These are the people who actually know the issues, Democrats and Republicans. We bring them together. We do simulated national security crises with them, so the issue of piracy off of Somalia, U.S.-Russia relations, etc. And we also take them out on retreats. We take them out to the woods. They go rafting together. They get to know each other, and then they go to the White House. There they're meeting with some national security staff. So they do all kinds of things together, but the result is they get to know each other. That's what we care about. And they can work together. And then the last thing is, of course, studying these issues and being informed, and I would welcome any questions that you all might have about the information that's in here. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Then I would open the floor up, as usual, for questions on the presentation itself, and then when we are through with those, we'll open it up for discussion. And I do urge you to bring the conversation to home, to Russia, and to Russian-American relations. Please.
Thank you. Working. Yes, but much more to divide the parties and so on. So he's putting a lot of people from the Socialist Party on very important, like ministers and so on, as Obama is doing. But so you are saying that it's, let's say, as Aldous Huxley said, an ideal word. You may be right, but in fact, I don't think that the policy which is being carried on now in the United States is on the level of having a general opinion and a consensus. It's more to divide more people, maybe.
So the question is basically whether bipartisanship is a divide and conquer strategy as opposed to a strategy that's aimed at, good outcomes. It's a fair question. I think sometimes it is, and I think that's why some people are cynical about it. I guess the distinction I would make is foreign policy. Foreign policy has traditionally not only been bipartisan, but it has been about outcomes, because I think at the end of the day, most Americans recognize that when it's America and the rest of the world, that Americans ultimately have to have an answer. We have to have a policy, and we have to sort of speak with one voice, because if there's a democratic policy for example, Iraq, and there's a Republican policy for Iraq, then we know that Iraq will remain divided as long as we are divided. So I think foreign policy is traditionally, and the numbers, the surveys that I showed you actually bear this out. Foreign policy has generally been an exception. So, I don't know the French political situation well, but from what you say, it sounds to me like Sarkozy is doing something that works for him that isn't actually about the outcomes. I think Obama's approach is a little bit different in that he's not trying to weaken his Democratic colleagues by any means. I don't think that would help him. I think what he's trying to do is he's trying to develop sort of a new constituency, not a third party, but a new constituency of Democrats and Republicans who generally are in the same page. This is something that President Clinton tried to do as well, but he tried to do it on too many issues. And I hope that Obama will focus on national security and foreign policy. So far, he hasn't had time.
Please, I ask just to wait for the microphone. Anna, here in the front. And then.
Right. Thank you. My name is Siski Haukkala, and I'm a special advisor at the Unit for Policy Planning and Research at the Finnish Ministry for Foreign Affairs, and I'm visiting Moscow for a few days. First of all, many thanks for your very interesting presentations. I really appreciated it, especially coming from Finland, which is based on a rather consensual political culture. This is, of course, a very interesting phenomena indeed, that politics is about struggle and fighting almost to the last. You mentioned the role of lobbying in terms of foreign policy as well, but I was wondering whether you could elaborate a little bit, because I have been intrigued to follow the case of foreign lobbyists in Washington, And I'm under the impression that even today, foreign governments, foreign actors are actually pursuing lobbying tactics vis-à-vis the American politicians in order to effect change in American policies abroad and perhaps also domestically. So I was wondering whether you could reflect upon this phenomena in general and also whether it feeds into the increased partisanship of American policies in any meaningful way.
Absolutely, that's a fantastic question. I think so your second question is whether increased lobbying by foreign governments has a direct role on partisanship in American politics. I don't think that the fact that foreign governments are lobbying, and they are, and I'll address that, that itself has an effect on the partisanship, because I don't think that particular foreign relationships, despite some arguments about, sort of Russia, being a priority of the Democratic administration, Poland having been more a priority of the last administration, I don't think that the relationships themselves are as partisan polarized yet. But the mere fact of lobbying having such influence in Washington, as I said, that does have an effect on partisanship in Congress, because members of Congress have to spend more time dealing with lobbyists and their issues, and also can get benefits from those lobbyists, can get favors, can get money for their campaigns, etc., so they don't have to engage with one another, and they don't have to engage with traditional sources of political power. So as far as what foreign lobbyists are doing, look, I mean, there are exposés being written on this all the time in American newspapers. In fact, by the way, Russia has been targeted in some of these. I think Ketchum is the firm that does Russia's lobbying in Washington D.C.'s big public relations firm. But just to pick on another country, Kazakhstan, Nursultan Nazarbayev's picture is now familiar to everyone in Washington D.C. because, amazingly, I read. He spent only $50,000. I didn't think it was this cheap, but he basically bought an ad on every bus shelter, where it protects you from the rain while you're waiting for the bus, in Washington, D.C. At the time of the Nuclear Security Summit. This was a brilliant maneuver. His firm, I believe, was East-West Communications, for anyone who wants to hire them. But for a very small amount of money, he got a picture of himself, and the words underneath the picture basically said, Kazakhstan got rid of its nuclear arsenal because we believe in global disarmament, and we're very happy to be coming to the United States to pursue this objective. And he also got a meeting with President Obama, and we know why. But basically, this was an incredibly effective way of putting an otherwise pretty irrelevant country for the average American, and even for the American political class, very much centrally on the map. So that's an example of the sort of thing that you can do. On a more elite level, look, who are lobbyists, right? I mean, lobbyists are not just kind of random people. Lobbyists have a certain resume. They have worked for Congress very often. They have worked in a presidential administration. They know people. They have personal friends. They're trusted sources. Oftentimes they are experts themselves. They are, in fact, experts. Sometimes people who ought to be at think tanks or at academic institutions instead go to lobbying organizations because they get paid a lot more. And so that means actually that on an elite level, they are often listened to. They will convene events that look a lot like this, except instead of being, totally transparent and funded by foundations and et cetera, they're funded by the government of name your country. But it looks like this. And so they do a lot of clever things. And yes, they absolutely do a ton of it, and you see it. I feel it every day in Washington. So thank you for the question.
Madam, Robert Burrows with the Nuclear Threat Initiative in Washington. I'd like to turn our attention to Russian-American relations and some very important votes that will be coming up in Congress in the near future. The ratification of the New START agreement, the approval of the 123 agreement, the eventual removal of Jackson Vanik, the comprehensive test ban ratification. Do you have any insights into how the Obama administration will be able to play this with Congress, particularly in view of the very partisan vote on health care and the questions we're having right now with financial reform?
Sure. Well, it's a huge question, but thank you. And first of all, I would I would take issue with your formulation, votes that will be coming up in Congress. The New START vote will be coming up in the Senate. The 123, Jackson Vanik, and CTBT, maybe they'll be coming up, maybe they won't. You know, the calendar, of course, is the bitterest enemy of the Obama administration at this point. They have a Supreme Court confirmation to get through in the Senate. They have New START, which won't be, I think it won't be too hard, and I'm happy to, to give you more on that, but it's going to take time, I think, is the message that you're hearing from both sides, even though Senator Lugar has described wanting ratification to be quick. It never is, or let me put it this way, when it is quick, oftentimes it goes the way you don't want it to go, like CTBT in 1999, 3 days of hearings, the vote was purely partisan no by an overwhelming majority. So what do I think will happen with START? My sense is that there are easily 67 votes in the Congress right now, in the Senate, for New START. I think if you take the 58 reliable Democrats, you probably add Joe Lieberman to that list, and then I think you take Dick Lugar and at least half a dozen Republicans that go with Dick Lugar. I don't think there's a problem getting to 67. I think the problem is that every previous arms control treaty in the U.S. Congress has been approved by a margin of roughly 80 or more with very little opposition. And the problem would be if you get a vote of 68 or 69 for the first real robust post-Cold War arms control treaty, that sends a message that arms control and U.S.-Russia relations, because all of these things have been intentionally woven into New START by the Obama administration, which has consistently said, this is about the reset, this is about my Prague agenda, et cetera, et cetera. A lot of weight has been put on New START. Well, it's a double-edged sword. The more weight that you put on New START, the more important New START's bipartisan ratification is. And like I said, not bipartisan with 6 Republicans or 7 or 8 Republicans. Bipartisan with 20 Republicans. Okay? So what my advice to the Obama administration would be, we know roughly speaking what the deal is going to look like. Republicans have said they want to hear that the U.S. administration is fully committed to missile defense, to the phased adaptive approach, which is the new sort of post-Bush approach to missile defense, which goes out over the next 10 years or so. And they want more investments in the nuclear complex in America, which is, you know, our weapons, our laboratories, our ability to store these things. Of course, Russia is investing in those things right now. And those, I think those two things are doable. You know, one of the important Russian concessions, despite the rhetoric recently, was to accept the formulation on missile defense as it is currently reflected in the preamble of the treaty, which means that the United States can continue to develop and deploy missile defense. Now, obviously, I think it'll benefit us both if that's a joint system, because it avoids the scenario that Russian leaders have been talking about, which is they're feeling compromised and needing to withdraw from the treaty. But from an American political standpoint, it's not hard for the Obama administration to give the type of assurances that they need to give, but those need to be given on a personal basis with, you know, at least a dozen key senators. On funding, you know, it's probably, I can't put a number on it, but it's $5 billion now. That's been called grossly inadequate by John McCain, who, despite the fact that he did that with John Kyle, who is probably never going to vote in favor of START, John McCain, I think, is a bellwether for a lot of national security Republicans. And what I've heard confidentially from key staff is that basically people of his ilk are persuadable on this as long as the administration is willing to give something. And I think the administration is willing to give something. So the equation is there. So my advice would be, you know, come up with the best deal that you can in negotiation with the Republicans. But for God's sakes, do not bring this to a vote just because you think you can get 68 votes. Wait until you can get 80 votes, even if it takes a year. It's worth doing. I don't think that 1, 2, 3, Jackson Vanik, or CTBT are on the horizon anytime soon, such that we need to get this out of the way quickly so that we can move on to those.
At that point in time, the noise coming out of Washington was that Washington was ready to talk about Jackson Vanik again. Now that was 2 or 3 months after the summit, or maybe it was maybe slightly before the summit. Somebody can correct me, but it was when the atmosphere was quite good, and things in Washington were not quite as acrimonious as they are now. Shuvalov today in the news announced that Russia will go ahead with WTO accession, even and specifically without waiting for Kazakhstan and Belarus. So I would suspect that if they do that with any coherence, and if they do try to push that forward through the organization, then that will force a decision in Washington. Can that be done?
Yeah, that's a great question, Sam. So basically, the sort of two questions are in there. One is, what are the prospects just on the merits for Jackson Vanik to be suspended with or eliminated with respect to Russia? But then, what is the relationship between WTO accession and Jackson Vanik, insofar as that would be obviously perceived as a violation of our WTO obligations if Russia were admitted. First, I would say, independently on the merits, when President Medvedev was speaking a couple of weeks ago during the Nuclear Security Summit at the Brookings Institution, he was asked that question, and it so happened that the chairman of the subcommittee on Europe from the U.S. House, Bill Delahunt, a Democrat from Massachusetts, was in the room, and Medvedev was somewhat negative about its prospects, but Bill Delahunt was not. Interesting. I'm not sure I agree with Delahunt. I believe this week he is holding or has already held a hearing. Is that right? It's already happened. It's coming up. Okay, so there's a hearing coming up in the subcommittee. By the way, that's Lucy Rojansky, my wife, who's at the U.S.-Russia Business Council. I feel like that's a very important admission to make on this question. So I'm not disinterested. I think it would be the right thing to do. It's symbolic. It's irrelevant. But I think that, well, remember my presentation. What effect do hearings have? Very little effect. It means Bill Delahunt is interested in it. Doesn't mean that there are 218 votes for it in the House. Now, that said, Sam, to your second and I think more important question is, if WTO accession proceeds, then our hand is forced. Then the answer is, yeah, I think it happens. Because I think that the substantive arguments are there, the political opposition is not strong enough, and then most importantly, it gets put on the calendar because it has to be put on the calendar, and members get actually put on the spot. One of the most important things to remember about the United States Congress, whether it's Senate or House, is that members do not act until they have to act. Because why should they? They put themselves out there. It creates a political liability. You don't act until you absolutely have to make a decision one way or the other, because then everyone else will have made a decision. And you're safe at least insofar as long as you don't make the opposite decision of everyone else, there are a group of other people who have voted the same way that you did. And I think with Jackson Vanik, what we would see then is we would see probably a vote in favor, and the rhetoric would all be centered around WTO accession, and they would be able to sort of cite Russia as becoming a normalized part of global economic institutions, which actually that's what it's all about. So it's a great question.
Thank you. Other questions?
We can talk about START. We can talk about U.S.-Russia relations.
Please. Just wait for the microphone, please, otherwise the translator can't hear.
I'm Paige Stoutland, also with the Nuclear Threat Initiative. A question about what's behind all of this partisanship or bipartisanship. I look at your graph there, and it leads to the obvious question of what causes this. I mean, have you looked at correlations? I mean, I look at that. I don't see anything I can correlate it to, but maybe you've done some analysis as to what's behind the data.
Yeah, that's a good question. The short answer is the weakness of this study has been that it was produced by a somewhat ideologically driven organization. We sort of knew what we wanted to do with it, which was to substantiate the conventional, or not the conventionalism, but the anecdotal evidence that we had from our board members that this was a problem. So we kind of, once we had the data that proved that, we stopped. I don't think that calls into question the conclusion, but what it doesn't give us is the basis of comparison. For example, comparing this graph with a graph of bipartisan voting on all issues, not just national security and foreign policy, or breaking down national security and foreign policy to, confirmation of ambassadors versus spending on defense, or breaking it down to regional issues. How does the U.S. deal with Russia and Eastern Europe versus how does it deal with Latin America? Are there differences in the level of bipartisanship? The short answer is we didn't look at that. the structural causes I already explained. I think that those are a big factor. If you do trace kind of the historical correlations, and again, this is hard to do because you're looking at every vote that took place during a specific period. So while it may have been, for example, that the Gulf of Tonkin resolution was an important resolution at that given period, there were 400 other votes that are included in that one number that we have on the graph. So it's very, very difficult to draw causation. We did go in and look at individual votes and how bipartisan they were or not. It wasn't very revealing. What you'll see in the report, though, is when you compare correlations of control of Congress, which is reflected in the red or the blue or the striped background for when control is split, and whether you have a Republican or Democratic president, and that's reflected at the top there. It's also colored. It's kind of hard to see. There is no correlation at all. It's almost identical whether Congress is split of Congress control of Congress is split, the White House and Congress are split, et cetera, et cetera. There is almost no correlation. Some things that we did find, though, were that unanimous voting, while it spiked at predictable times, for example, after September 11th, there was a ton of unanimous voting. A lot of unanimous votes are total throwaways. So, for example, in 1997, the U.S. Congress voted to condemn the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact in 1997. And it was a unanimous vote. Fantastic. So we compared this graph with and without unanimous votes being included. That had no effect. So what I'm telling you is the data is limited.
Right. I'm wondering whether there be correlations to external sociological factors or economic factors. Do people always vote together when times are good and not vote together when the economy's in the tank or something? But
well,
anyway.
one way of looking at it, it depends on how narrowly you want to go with the data. Oh, by the way, that reminds me, I just want to mention one thing. This is also in the paper. We did find the one consistent correlation appeared to be during war times. If you look at war times, high levels of bipartisan voting in the beginning of the war, low levels towards the end of the war. And that may be a post-World War II phenomenon because that wasn't true during World War II, but you could also argue that that was the last war that the U.S. really decisively won, as we'll be reminded in the next week here. That was one correlation that was quite interesting. As far as the economic or other external factors, I think if you take a really broad sample size and you look at the fact that bipartisanship was generally much, much higher in the post-war kind of boom and the kind of confidence that came of having won the war, here we are sitting in Moscow. It's a story that should be somewhat familiar, right? People sort of believe in the state, believe in the national enterprise because of the kind of psychological reassurance of victory. And that starts to kind of, look at the 70s and 80s, right? It starts to really plunge. And then, the 90s were economically a pretty good time. Well, we have decent levels of bipartisanship. There's Clinton, the new Democrat, is in the White House. But then, it plunged again pretty quickly, and we've maintained a pretty strongly downward trend, even in the good economic times that we had up until the last crash. So, again, it's really tough to find correlations here. This would be a kind of a PhD dissertation, I think, to break this down and look at the individual trends that you asked about. But it's a very good question.
Благодарю. У меня вопрос в продолжение того, который задал уже Сэм Грин. Мэтт, если я вас правильно понял, вы сказали, что бывают прецеденты, когда лоббистов финансирует правительство иностранных государств.
Когда?
Да?
Yeah.
Поскольку поправка Джексона-Веника до сих пор жива, насколько я помню, это свидетельствует о том, что российские лоббисты не слишком преуспели. Что бы вы им посоветовали для повышения эффективности их усилий? Заранее спасибо.
How can Russia's lobbyists be more effective in getting Jackson Vanik on the agenda? Look, I think we have we have kind of a disconnect in the U.S. and Russia about what matters. Yes, arms control and hard security issues matter a lot. But I just spent the last, half week sitting with Russian colleagues out at Snigiri, not far from Moscow here, in something called the Dartmouth Conference, which has been, by the way, approaching its 50th anniversary. And I think what was very revealing about that is that there are a lot of areas where the sort of assumptions that Russians come to the table with are just very, very different than American assumptions about what's important. And I think that's one of the reasons that Russian lobbying is just not as effective as it could be. I think we need a Russian lobby in Washington, but we need a Russian lobby that looks different from the Russian lobby that we have right now. I think right now we have a Russian lobby that represents the Russian government, not a Russian lobby that represents the Russian people. And I think if you compare it to a lot of the other national and ethnic interest groups that are effective in Washington, certainly they have bigger constituencies or just more established constituencies of immigrants in the United States. Ukrainians, Poles, Jews, Hispanics and Latinos, etc. It is certainly a problem for Russia that constituency of sort of Russians does not exist, and it's a function of Cold War policies. But there are other things that the Russian government could do. If you look at the issues where Americans and Russians basically share the same interests, and there, yes, nuclear weapons and hard security is on that agenda, as I said, but it's things like promotion of small business and trade relationships, transparency of business and trade environments, things like, frankly, adoption, as difficult an issue as that's been in the last few weeks. You know, how do Americans and Russians not share the same basic interests on that? We do. Dealing with the problems of migration that both countries face from different parts of the world, of course, but basically the same types of problems of, you know, immigrants living in these separated enclaves, not learning the language, not fully integrating with society, sometimes posing security threats, etc. Dealing with terrorism. We have all these sort of common interests. That's not what you hear from the Russian lobby and the Russian interest group in Washington. Usually you hear an effort either to play a sort of tit-for-tat game with the United States about what you've done wrong and in response to what you're telling us we've done wrong, so it's very defensive. And then the rest of the time you kind of hear about START and the big picture agenda stuff that you hear about anyway. You don't hear a lot of kind of the social level, civil society engagement, and I think that's because the lobby represents the Russian government and it doesn't represent the Russian people.
Мэтт, следует ли вас понять так, что лобби российского правительства представляет не столько национальные интересы России, сколько интересы доминирующих групп России?
Yeah, I think that's right. And that's a function of the difference between your political system and our political system. Now, I'm not here to sell you our system, but I think it's a correct observation. And but look, I mean, there are so many authoritarian governments around the world, much of just dramatically more authoritarian than Russia's is, that have really effective lobbies in the United States because of the engagement on the level of people. Because people have left those countries. Now, those people certainly don't agree with the governments that they've left, but they've created an environment in which there's sensitivity among Americans. Cuba is a fantastic example. There is sensitivity among Americans to what matters to Cubans, what matters about Cuba, why Cuba should be on the agenda. Okay, Russia is barely on the agenda in the United States. It's on the agenda a little bit more today because of START and nuclear issues, and I am not trying to denigrate the importance of that. But there's no constituency for a U.S.-Russia relationship being strong that is outside of that in Washington today, and there needs to be one.
Not that has made the relationship with Raul Castro any easier.
No, certainly not. But I blame that on Raul Castro.
Fair enough. Please.
Спасибо за очень интересное выступление. У меня к вам два вопроса. Первый. Вы упомянули роль Верховного суда в процессе принятия решений. Насколько я знаю, был прецедент, когда Верховный суд принял решение и разрешил корпорациям вносить donation вклады в кампании, избирательные кампании. Кто выиграет больше от этого решения? Демократы или все-таки, вероятно, республиканцы? Это первый вопрос. И второй вопрос, вот, относящийся уже к российско-американским отношениям, как призывает наш председатель собрания. Я имею в виду соглашение 123, касающееся сотрудничества в области ядерной энергетики. В свое время оно было отозвано Бушем, чтобы его спасти. Если администрация Обамы внесет его снова на рассмотрение в Конгресс, Как вы думаете, будет какое-то большинство, которое поддержит? Или точнее, там же, если не будет negative resolution, оно будет автоматически принято. Я уверена, что такая резолюция будет внесена, но преодолеют ли ее в Конгрессе? И сможет ли пройти это соглашение? Спасибо.
Thank you for that question. So first, with respect to the Supreme Court decision, the case was called Citizens United. I actually think that's the wrong question. The question is not whether Republicans or Democrats won from that, because if you look at the numbers, corporations give almost evenly to Democrats and Republicans. They're not stupid. They know that sometimes Democrats are in power and sometimes Republicans are in power. The question is, what does that mean for our political system? And in some respects, it is a return to an earlier era, prior to some of these reforms in campaign finance and generally in transparency in government. The problem with giving you a sort of clear answer on this is that, as I hope I made clear in my presentation, some of the reforms of U.S. government have not been good reforms. They have had actually unintended consequences of taking away from the effectiveness of government. So I think, on the one hand, the Citizens United decision definitely does increase the power of, kind of boardrooms and stockholders to elect government officials, which seems like a negative thing, but that is the jurisprudence, that is the legal belief of this Supreme Court. If you look at the actual decision, they basically say they treat corporations as people. So why shouldn't people have free speech and a vote? And these happen to be rich people. So, on the other hand, though, I think, political markets are like any other market, which is the market responds to demand. And if you look at some of the more recent campaign finance reform, like I said, capping individual donations at $2,500, the market will find a way, and it has. So it's created these sort of almost quasi-corporations in the form of bundling organizations, political action committees, so in some cases non-incorporated individuals. So, for example, Sam has 100 friends, each of whom can afford to give $2,500. So all of a sudden now, Sam is a $250,000 donor, right? All I have to do is go to him, and he has to say, I pledge to you that I will bring you $2,500 from each of my friends. And he does that. So now he's playing the role of a corporation with less accountability and less transparency than a corporation would have, because he doesn't have to report to anyone. He's just a guy. And this happens. And in a lot of cases it happens with he's a great guy, but this happens with the same people who were running the campaign organizations and the corporate political wings 20 years ago. They just do it differently today. As far as the 1-2-3 agreement, I don't know what's going to happen. I think that the climate actually is probably more positive now after the plutonium disposition agreement finally got taken care of. But I don't know. I think that any desire that there might have been in the last couple of years in the aftermath of Georgia to kind of punish Russia in the Congress, I don't think that there's any more of that kind of proactive desire to do something harmful to derail U.S.-Russia relations or to derail the reset. I mean, don't get me wrong. There are some people in Washington who make that argument, but I don't think that there's a political will to do anything. The question is almost more about inertia and whether there's political will to actively put something like 1-2-3 back on the agenda. Some of that depends on what Russia prioritizes. And we did hear President Medvedev talk about it. I'm assuming that means he's talked about it privately with President Obama. These are two presidents who've talked to each other more often than U.S. and Russian leaders have, certainly since Clinton and Yeltsin. So, I'd say the chance is good if you believe that this relationship is a good relationship, and it does seem to be a pretty good relationship. But, again, sorry to be always on the one hand, on the other hand, but on the other hand, we've also seen the limits of President Obama's ability to tell even his own party members like Harry Reid and Nancy Pelosi when to put things on the agenda and what exactly they should be.
I should have mentioned at the beginning of this meeting that by training Matt is a lawyer, and so you're going to get these sorts of responses. Please.
Thank you. My name is Oki. I'm a Moscow correspondent of Japanese newspaper Mainichi. My question is about negotiation process on new START treaty. And maybe I'm afraid that I'm repeating some questions, but for journalists, it was we were sometimes irritated that both sides said that the final agreement is close to and towards the end of last year, and several times it was postponed, and then finally it was agreed on April. So this, if say it's some delay of this negotiation process, how this how to say bipartisan process or how to say objection of Republican Party has affected to this delay of the final agreement? Thank you.
Simple answer is I don't think that partisanship played any issue whatsoever in the negotiations, simply because the negotiations were between executive administrations. It was between a Democratic president and his appointee, who used to run this office and is a Democrat, as far as I know, and a Republican, and a Russian, professional diplomat. But I think where you will see the role of partisanship is in the ratification process, because remember, the agreement doesn't mean anything until it's not implementable until it's ratified. And I think you're absolutely right to suggest that partisanship will play a delaying role. That's the first effect that it will have. Before it even has a chance to color the substance of the conversation, it will make sure, I would say, I would give sort of an equal chance between there being serious hearings and a vote on this during the lame duck session, which is after the November elections but before January when the new Congress comes in. I'd say 50-50 chance that it happens then, and 50% that it happens in the new Congress altogether. And if it happens in the new Congress, I'll tell you one thing, it's not going to be the first thing on the new Congress's agenda. It's going to be down the road. So we're talking about kind of later in 2011. So I'd say 50-50 chance there. And that delay, yeah, it's absolutely because of partisanship, because like I said, the administration can't be sure that they have the votes.
Виктор Кувалдин, МГУ и фонд Горбачева. Я хотел бы вернуться вот к этой таблице. Вы взяли большой период, почти 65 лет. И мне кажется, что в крайних точках, то есть в 1945 и 2009 году, это две разные Америки. В 1945 году это белая Америка европейского происхождения, значительным, но ограниченным афроамериканским элементом. Сегодня это Америка, где треть населения составляют меньшинства, и их удельный вес растет. То есть Америка превращается в тенденции в страну меньшинств, и из первично-американского, из первично-европейского общества по происхождению становится глобальным обществом. Вот с вашей точки зрения, сам по себе этот факт облегчает или осложняет поиски двухпартийного консенсуса? Спасибо.
Thank you. First of all, I would agree with you. It's two different Americas, but I wouldn't agree with you that it's two different Americas primarily because of the ethnic composition of America in 1945 versus in 2009. If you look at the statistics, it's true that most minority groups, Latinos, Hispanics, African Americans, Asians to some extent vote more Democrat, and whites vote more Republican. And if you look at kind of the extreme examples, the anecdotal examples today in Washington, the Tea Party movement is mostly a white movement. This is a movement of sort of extreme conservatives. I don't think that they're marginal. I don't think they're irrelevant, but I think that they're pretty extreme and they're almost exclusively white. That said, though, if you look at the numbers, the way they break down in the actual elections, you have a fair amount of splitting within every ethnic community. There are great inroads, even into the African American community, which is historically the bulwark of the Democratic Party. So I'm not sure that that's entirely true. What I would suggest has changed more than anything, which is certainly relevant to the issue of race relations in America, is that there are no longer what I would call what used to be called Copperhead Democrats, conservative Southern Democrats who are Democrats only because of the Civil War legacy. This goes back to the 19th century, which is that Republicans were the party of Abraham Lincoln. Those Democrats today are Republicans. In fact, you had some people who officially, personally, instead of retiring and then a new person being elected, they just changed their party. They changed from being Democrats to being Republicans. You still have some very conservative Democrats from the South and the southwestern United States, but generally speaking, those people today are Republicans. So the effect that this has had is, instead of having a group of conservative Democrats that Republicans could reach out to compromise on national security in exchange for supporting them on generally conservative social policies, now Democrats present a united front of liberals. Liberals on foreign policy, liberals on domestic policy. And the same thing could be said about Republicans. It's changed, actually. It used to be true that there were no more, other than the two ladies from Maine, Olympia Snowe and Susan Collins, there were no more New England Republicans. Just none. There were no Republicans being elected from liberal northeastern states like Massachusetts and Connecticut and New Hampshire and Vermont. Scott Brown, a Republican, was just elected from Massachusetts to Ted Kennedy's seat. It was viewed as a huge sea change in American politics. But if you actually look at Scott Brown and what he stands for, in almost any other part of the country, he would be a Democrat. You know, he's not a very conservative Republican. In fact, I would suggest he's probably one of the more reliable votes for START, because, you know, a Republican elected from an overwhelmingly Democratic state like Massachusetts is probably not going to be able to go home and win another election, which he faces in 2 years, because this was a special election that he won, if he has a very conservative voting record. So my argument would be, look, it's possible that we might see a return to what it looked like 65 years ago, where you really did have conservative Democrats and liberal Democrats and conservative Republicans and liberal Republicans. It would be great. It would be really good, because then there would be more just sort of general mixing between the parties, more people on each side to reach out to. Today, that's the big difference in America. You have monolithic parties. Republicans are almost totally unified in being extremely conservative, and Democrats, with the exception of a few folks at the middle who might lose their seats in a few months, are almost completely very liberal.
Thank you. Niklas Lindqvist, Embassy of Finland. I think you mentioned that Russia figures on the Washington agenda very much because of START right now. The question then would be that what happens when START gets ratified? Does it disappear from that agenda, or do we have something else? Is there anything you think in the arms control agenda that could be the next? I mean, President Obama is talking about a nuclear-free world, giving hopes for more negotiations. There's been talk about non-strategic nuclear arms, the conventional forces in Europe, and so forth. Just like to hear your view on this.
Sure. I think that Russia will remain on the president's agenda. I think he's been pretty clear about that. He's going to face some tough political times after this election, during and after this upcoming congressional election. But, I think he's put out a marker with the reset, with the bilateral commission. I think he said Russia's going to be on his agenda. For the Congress, though, I think it's a different story. The Congress generally is not as engaged on foreign policy as it has been for a long time. There are a lot of good things about John Kerry, but he's not a very strong Senate Foreign Relations Committee chairman. I think it's up to a few key leaders in Congress to go out and bring the foreign policy issues in front of their fellow members, to lead delegations, to hold hearings. That's just not happening. Whether there will be attention for Russia after START ratification, assuming it succeeds, is a question of what Obama has put in the pipeline and how far along it is. Because, like I said, Congress doesn't make decisions until it has to, and it has plenty of other things that it can spend its time on once it has taken care of START. So let's say that, START gets dealt with sometime in 2011, which, as I said, I think is quite likely. What else might Congress have on its agenda? Well, depending on how fast it goes, maybe it would have, Jackson Vanik because of WTO, possibly. Maybe it would have some sort of new commercial agreement with Russia. I don't know exactly what that might look like. That would be a very good thing. Perhaps it would have some involvement in funding decisions for missile defense that actually had bearing on a joint missile defense system. Because certainly Congress loves linkage. If there's a way to bring in something that they're worried about to something else, they will do that. So if the U.S. and Russia are proceeding on a joint missile defense program, and Congress is voting about funding the defense authorization bill, which is where the money for missile defense would come from, then they might hold a hearing, and they might actually learn something if people attend the hearing. But those are big ifs. So the short answer is no, Congress is not very engaged on Russia. By the way, that caucus that I mentioned, as far as I know, it hasn't done anything. This is the sort of non-committee interest group on Russia. If any of you guys know differently, I'd love to hear it, but I haven't heard that it's done anything. So, I'm not very optimistic.
Thank you. And I think on that note, we will shift our format a little bit. It's been an interesting discussion. I don't want to put an end to it. I want to invite you through those doors to the back for some light refreshments and informal continuation of our conversation. I'd like to thank all of you for your questions and comments. I'd like to thank our speaker, Matt Rojansky, who is here for the first time at Carnegie, but certainly not for the last. And last but not least, I'd like to thank our translator for her hard work this evening.